They destroyed my orchards overnight. I wish that were hyperbole. But if you had stood on Pine Falls Road that morning, you'd have seen the aftermath for yourself. My once thriving fruit trees leveled in a matter of hours. When I arrived at dawn, the smell of churned dirt and splintered branches hit me like a punch in the chest. A brand new tennis court now gleamed where rows of apple and pear trees had stood for decades. I still remember the orchard's springtime blossoms, my father's pride and joy. Yet here it was, replaced by shimmering asphalt and a row of corporate-sponsored benches. And that's how it all began. How the Oak Brook Hills Homeowners Association lit the fuse on the biggest legal firestorm this county has ever seen. They had no idea that the man whose heritage they'd casually bulldozed was also the county's top litigator, with an undefeated streak in property disputes that made me either a hero or a menace, depending on which side you asked. It all started on a Monday, though started might be the wrong word. The seeds of conflict had been sown months before, when the Oak Brook Hills HOA circulated talk of a community expansion initiative. At the time, I was preoccupied, working a high-profile case in the city. My mother had passed away recently, leaving me the final steward of the orchard my parents had nurtured since the early 80s. The property sat right at the boundary of Oak Brook Hills, separated only by a winding creek. The orchard had always been outside the HOA's jurisdiction, or so I thought. But that notion shattered when the morning's dew revealed asphalt lines carved into what was unmistakably my farmland. It was as if some cosmic hand had decided to repaint the lines of ownership without ever giving me a say. Oh, but I planned to speak, and speak loudly. I confronted the first person I saw, a harried construction foreman wrestling with a clipboard. His bright orange safety vest gleamed under the rising sun. He shielded his eyes with a gloved hand and looked me up and down. "Sir, please don't cross the caution tape," he said. Behind him, a bulldozer idled loudly, choking on the orchard's remains. I pointed to the swath of annihilated trees, voice trembling with restrained fury. "This is my property. I never gave you or anyone else permission to tear it down and pave it over." The foreman shot me a puzzled look, flipping through official-looking papers, each bearing the Oak Brook Hills HOA letterhead. "I have permits here," he insisted, "all properly filed. Says the lot belongs to Oak Brook Hills. They're building an extension to the community tennis facilities." My heart hammered in my chest as I read the line, "Parcel 22B belongs to Oak Brook Hills Homeowners Association." Parcel 22B was my orchard's designated zoning code. They had the paperwork, and it all looked frighteningly legitimate. I held it together long enough to figure out who'd orchestrated this fiasco. The name Elizabeth Carter kept appearing on the dotted lines. Miss Carter was the HOA's president, a woman rumored to be both charming and ruthless. I dealt with my share of real estate battles, but everything about this stank of forged documents or shady rezoning. I'd never once signed an agreement relinquishing a single inch of the orchard, yet these papers seemed to say otherwise. Stunned, I stepped away from the foreman, pacing along the orchard's ruined perimeter. Tree stumps jutted from the ground, raw and damp with sap. The orchard's oldest tree, a 40-year-old Macintosh apple that my father had planted the day I was born, lay in pieces like driftwood scattered across the dirt. While the foreman resumed directing his crew, I called the county records office. My contact, Marissa, sounded half asleep until she heard the urgency in my voice. Then she became dead serious, promising to check the land deeds on file. The next call I placed was to my friend John, a paralegal who specialized in property disputes. We'd studied at the same law school, gone our separate ways but kept in touch. He said he'd come down that evening with any relevant documents he could find. Before I could dial a third number, a shiny black SUV pulled up, tinted windows masking who was inside. When it parked, the door swung open and out stepped Elizabeth Carter herself, high heels clicking ominously on the fresh asphalt. She paused for a moment, scanning the orchard's remains with a hint of satisfaction. Her expression was poised, confident. Spotting me, she approached, her tone brisk yet superficially polite. "Mr. Harris, is it? I believe we spoke once when your mother passed away. My condolences, by the way." She offered a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'm sorry for the inconvenience here, but we've secured full legal rights to expand the Oakbrook Hills amenities. We posted notices months ago. Her voice trailed off as I stared at her, incredulous. Notices? I echoed, fighting back the urge to scream. Where did you post them? Your private mailbox? Because I sure didn't see any posted on my property. Elizabeth shrugged elegantly, the slightest arch in her eyebrows. We complied with all county requirements, Mr. Harris. If you have concerns, please feel free to bring them up at our next HOA meeting. She handed me a crisp pamphlet detailing the new tennis court and said in an airy voice, "We believe this facility will bring tremendous value to the community, but if you think you have a case, we can discuss further." That's when the pit formed in my stomach. I'd met too many bullies like Elizabeth. She believed she'd covered her tracks, that the orchard was just unfortunate collateral in her grand plan for a more prestigious neighborhood. As she strode away, giving orders to the foreman, I took a deep breath. My professional instincts told me something huge was amiss here. Zoning laws, contradictory deeds, environmental regulations for orchard land, and Elizabeth acted as if she had the entire county in her pocket. But she'd just awakened a beast she probably hadn't expected. I might have been wearing a casual plaid shirt and dusty boots, but behind that simple attire was an undefeated real estate litigator who dismantled corporate giants for smaller crimes than this. By midday, my orchard looked like a wasteland. The bulldozers had retreated, leaving behind the completed outline of an opulent tennis court. The paint was still fresh, the nets hung with brand new tags, and a sign reading "Private Use Only, Oakbrook Hills HOA Members, My Orchard." And every memory rooted in it had been erased beneath that meticulously paved surface. I swore to myself I'd make them regret it. Every dollar they'd spent would become a question mark in their ledger by the time I was done. That evening, John arrived at my house with a stack of printouts and his ever-present laptop. The moment he stepped inside, I greeted him with a worn stare and he patted my shoulder. "I brought everything I could get my hands on," he said. "But I'm warning you, it looks complicated. The county's official record states that your orchard was annexed by Oakbrook Hills about 2 months ago. There are rezoning documents dated last year referencing some kind of transitional ownership." My jaw clenched. Transitional ownership? I never sold this land, never signed a single contract for it. John gave a grim nod. "I know. But they have a document with your father's signature. They're claiming your father sold the orchard's eastern section to the HOA right before he passed." My heart sank at the mention of my father's name. He died 6 years ago, so how could he have sold anything right before he passed? It didn't take a forensic expert to see that was fishy. "Show me," I demanded. John opened his laptop, scrolling to a scanned copy of the alleged sale agreement. The signature was messy, but they'd spelled my father's name incorrectly by inverting his middle initial. I stared at it for a solid minute. Dad would never have messed up his own name. On top of that, the date on the document was long after he was bedridden and barely able to speak. This was a forgery, a clumsy, brazen forgery. I wanted to drive over to Elizabeth's house and slam this in her face, but John laid a hand on my arm to calm me. "We need a strategy," he said softly. "You know better than anyone how the legal system works. We gather evidence, file for an emergency injunction, and blow this wide open." He was right. My impulsive rage had to be channeled into the unstoppable force I'd become in the courtroom. So that night we laid out a plan. Gather every piece of evidence. Contact the county's property board. Speak with the local environmental office. Because orchard lands often fell under special agricultural protections that made them more difficult to rezone, and if the HOA bulldozed it without an environmental impact study, they'd violated at least half a dozen state regulations. So sleep was elusive. I drifted off in the early hours of the morning, images of my orchard swirling like ghosts in my mind. The next day, I arrived at the county courthouse bright and early, a stack of paperwork in hand. Marissa at the records desk greeted me with the same worried expression from before. "You're not going to like this," she said quietly, handing me a file folder. "It looks official. The notary stamp belongs to Dan Jenkins, one of the local attorneys who's known for representing the Oakbrook Hills HOA." My eyes scanned the pages, every line dripping with fraudulent authority. "I'm going to contest this," I told her. "I suspect Jenkins either forged it or oversaw the forgery, and once I prove it in court, every inch of that tennis court is coming up." Stepping outside the records office, the glare of the midday sun felt harsher than usual. I took a moment to collect myself on the courthouse steps. It was time to pay Dan Jenkins a visit. His office was only a few blocks away, a modern glass building that seemed out of place in our otherwise quaint county seat. I marched through the lobby, ignoring the receptionist's pleas to wait, and burst into his office. He looked up from his desk, eyes narrowing. "Well, if it isn't Carter Harris," he said, feigning friendliness. "I heard you were back in town." I slammed the folder onto his polished desk. "You're behind this, aren't you? Your notary stamp is on the bogus deed that claims Oak Brook Hills owns my orchard." Dan leaned back with a condescending smile. "I assure you, everything is fully legal. Your father sold that land fair and square." My fists tightened. "My father died 6 years ago. He was in no condition to sign anything in his final days. You think forging his signature is going to hold up in court?" Dan's gaze flickered. I caught the hint of uncertainty, but it vanished quickly. "I'm sure there's some confusion about dates. If you have an issue, take it up with the HOA." I wanted to lunge across the desk. Instead, I forced calm into my voice. "Elizabeth Carter's the puppet master, and you're her lapdog, but you just messed with the wrong orchard and the wrong attorney." I snatched the folder back and stormed out. Behind me, I could hear him muttering something to his paralegal, likely about preparing for a fight. By the time I left Dan Jenkins's office, I had enough adrenaline coursing through my veins to power a locomotive. I headed to the county zoning board next, hoping to confirm or debunk the orchard's reclassification. That's when I learned the next bombshell. The Oak Brook Hills HOA had quietly petitioned the board last year to declare that section of farmland community use, citing an influx of new residents who needed more recreation space. The reclassification was approved under suspiciously swift circumstances. I demanded to see who had filed the official petition. The clerk pointed me to a line that read, "Authorized by E. Carter, President." It was a twisted puzzle. On paper, it appeared as if Dad sold the orchard, then Oak Brook Hills petitioned to reclassify, and the board rubber-stamped it. If I hadn't been away so much, maybe I would have caught wind of their scheme earlier. But regrets wouldn't help me now. What mattered was tearing down this web of deceit. I filed my own motion for an emergency hearing, requesting an immediate halt to all further development on my orchard. Then I called in every favor I could from my colleagues around the state. Environmental experts, private investigators, even a forensic document analyst, to prove the signature on the deed was forged. That week, I spent more hours in my old truck than I did at home. Each day brought a new revelation about the HOA's manipulations. I discovered that Elizabeth Carter had gained her position by systematically ousting the previous board members, promising grand projects to increase property values. She lured new residents with visions of pristine tennis courts, private parks, and exclusive clubhouse expansions. With each promise, she likely raked in more in HOA fees. The orchard was simply her newest trophy, a glittering prize to show prospective buyers. She had no interest in the orchard's history or the fact that it provided fresh produce to local markets for decades. In her eyes, it was just empty space waiting to be improved. One evening, I stopped by the orchard's remains, unable to stay away even though the place broke my heart. The tennis court was now fully lined with fresh nets installed. A group of teenagers, presumably from Oak Brook Hills, practiced serves and backhands like it had always been theirs. They paid no attention to the broken orchard stumps scattered around the perimeter, nor the broken heart of a man who'd grown up climbing those very trees. Part of me wanted to scream at them to get off my land, but it wasn't their fault. They were pawns in this bigger game. Instead, I simply watched, fists clenched at my sides, until the sun dipped behind the pines. John called to tell me the court date was set for 2 weeks from now. Apparently, the judge saw enough red flags in my motion to expedite the hearing. That was good news. A small victory in a war that was about to go nuclear. I spent those 2 weeks working around the clock. By the time the hearing day dawned, I was loaded for bear. My evidence binder was monstrous. Bank statements, emails between HOA officials referencing orchard expansions, affidavits from neighbors who saw suspicious activity near the orchard's boundary late at night. But the crown jewel was the forensic analysis of my father's signature, proving beyond doubt that it had been crudely forged. If justice had any meaning, I'd watch Elizabeth Carter squirm as her empire cracked. The morning of the hearing, the courtroom hummed with tension. On one side, the Oak Brook Hills legal team, Dan Jenkins at the helm, with Elizabeth Carter by his side in a crisp navy suit exuding confidence. On the other side, it was just me and John. Yet we weren't alone. Friends, local farmers, and even some Oak Brook Hills residents who disliked the HOA's tyranny had shown up. The judge, a stern woman named Harriet Cole, took her seat. "Mr. Harris," she said, scanning my motion, "you're requesting an immediate injunction against the Oak Brook Hills HOA to stop any use or further development of what you claim is your orchard, is that correct?" I nodded, jaw set. "Yes, Your Honor. I have evidence that the deed transferring ownership is a forgery and that the orchard was rezoned unlawfully." Dan Jenkins smirked, rising to counter. "Your Honor, we have documentation showing that the orchard was sold by Mr. Harris's father, that the rezone was approved by the county, and that all relevant notices were posted. This is simply a case of Mr. Harris disagreeing with his father's decision or not staying informed." The judge's gaze didn't waver. "We'll see," she said. "Mr. Harris, present your evidence." I launched into a methodical presentation of the facts. I showed the timeline, the suspicious date on which the orchard was claimed sold, my father's failing health at that time, and the forensic report concluding the signature was not his. Each piece of evidence I dropped felt like a hammer blow, and I could see Elizabeth Carter shifting in her seat. Her confident veneer looked a bit cracked now. A faint line creased her forehead. Dan Jenkins tried to object repeatedly, but the judge waved him off, fascinated by the magnitude of the alleged fraud. When I introduced environmental expert Andrea Gill to testify about the orchard's agricultural significance, the tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Andrea explained how orchard land can't be repurposed so abruptly without a thorough environmental review. Trees that old are part of a delicate local ecosystem. She also mentioned that orchard soil can contain residual pesticides that must be handled safely. "If the HOA bulldozed it overnight," she said, adjusting her glasses, "that's a serious breach of county environmental guidelines." Elizabeth Carter's expression darkened with each passing moment. Her supporters in the gallery squirmed under the judge's increasingly skeptical gaze. At last, Dan Jenkins called Elizabeth to the stand. She tried to project calm, but her voice wavered. "My intention," she insisted, "was always to improve the community. We believed we had the rightful deed, and the orchard was underutilized. I'm not a legal expert, but my team assured me everything was above board." I almost rolled my eyes at the faux innocence. The judge clearly wasn't buying it. "Ms. Carter," she said, leaning forward, "did you at any point verify the authenticity of Mr. Harris's father's signature, especially given he was reportedly ill during that period?" Elizabeth hesitated. I relied on Dan Jenkins's firm for that. They told me it was legitimate." Dan Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. The judge's gaze shot to him. "Is this true, Mr. Jenkins?" He cleared his throat. "We performed the standard checks, Your Honor." That was the moment. I rose to my feet. Permission to show the court the forensic analysis of the signature. The judge granted it. As I displayed the side-by-side comparison of my father's known signature and the forgery, a hush fell over the room. The discrepancies were blatant. "Even a cursory review would have flagged this as suspicious," I said, my voice echoing in the silent courtroom. "This was no mere oversight, it was a willful act of fraud." In that instant, Elizabeth Carter's composure shattered. She muttered something about not being aware and trusting the attorneys. The judge's expression hardened, a flicker of anger crossed her features. "This is very concerning," she stated, then turned to me. "Given the evidence, I'm granting the emergency injunction." The Oak Brook Hills HOA is prohibited from utilizing the tennis court or making further alterations to the orchard until we have a full trial. Mr. Jenkins, Ms. Carter. We will also be investigating the notary process here. A wave of relief washed over me, accompanied by the faint murmurs of approval from the gallery. Elizabeth's face was pale, Dan Jenkins's jaw clenched so tight I thought it might crack. The hearing concluded and I walked out of that courtroom with the first real sense of victory since this nightmare began. But I knew the battle wasn't over. Elizabeth would fight back, appealing the injunction, claiming ignorance. She was cunning, and people like her, with money and connections, could delay justice if given enough rope. As expected, the HOA's next move was to demonize me publicly. They circulated emails painting me as an outsider bent on destroying their community improvements. They claimed the orchard was a hazard, that the trees were rotting, and that the new tennis court was a necessary upgrade. Social media lit up with debates. Some Oak Brook Hills residents believed the propaganda, but others, especially those who'd once tasted the orchard's fresh fruit at local markets, knew better. Meanwhile, I kept building my case. A local journalist, Dana Foster, approached me to do an in-depth story on orchard displacement. I invited her to see the orchard's destruction firsthand. She arrived with a photographer who captured harrowing shots of the uprooted stumps, the half-buried orchard sign Dad had hammered into the ground decades ago. I gave them copies of the forged deed, the environmental reports, the incriminating emails referencing pushing this orchard sale through quietly. Elizabeth Carter refused to speak on record. Dan Jenkins gave a canned statement about all relevant laws being followed, but the press coverage ignited a wave of public outrage, turning the orchard into a rallying cry against HOA overreach. The next big confrontation happened at the Oak Brook Hills monthly board meeting. Despite the tension, I decided to attend in person, determined to confront Elizabeth on her own turf. The meeting took place in the community clubhouse, a lavish space with marble floors and golden chandeliers. As soon as I walked in, conversations hushed. All eyes turned on me. I felt no fear, just a burning sense of righteous anger. Elizabeth Carter stood at the podium, flanked by board members. She tried to maintain decorum, opening the meeting with a formal greeting and reciting the agenda. But whispers and muttering flooded the room. People wanted to hear about the orchard fiasco. A few agenda items passed, and then Elizabeth cleared her throat. Before we move on, we need to address the situation regarding the extension of our tennis facilities. Mr. Harris, would you like to speak? I walked to the front, ignoring the daggers Elizabeth shot my way. Ladies and gentlemen, I began. I am Carter Harris. My parents built and maintained the orchard your HOA destroyed. In less than 24 hours, you bulldozed decades of growth and replaced it with a tennis court that stands on questionable legal ground. Literally. A flurry of murmurs spread across the room. I held up the forged deed. My father never signed this. It's a forgery and we have proof. I've also obtained an injunction preventing any further use of that tennis court until the legal matter is resolved. A man in the back shouted, "That orchard was part of this neighborhood for years. Why'd you tear it down without telling us?" Another woman glared at Elizabeth. "We voted on improvements, but we were told all the land was properly purchased." Elizabeth swallowed hard, raising a hand to restore order. "We were acting in good faith," she said through clenched teeth. "I believed the orchard was sold legitimately. Mr. Harris is entitled to his opinion, but the HOA stands by its action." I suppressed a bitter laugh. "Your actions, Miss Carter, have landed you in a legal battle you can't win. Once we go to trial, the county will see your forged documents and lack of environmental compliance. That tennis court will be demolished and you'll be footing the bill." She stared at me, defiance flaring in her eyes. "Don't be so sure," she snapped. "The board and our attorneys are prepared to defend this every step of the way. If you're expecting a quick settlement, you'll be sorely disappointed." I leaned forward. "I'm not interested in a quick settlement. I'm interested in justice for my family's legacy, and for anyone else you've bullied under the guise of community improvements." The crowd erupted into chatter. Some residents voiced support for the orchard, others insisted on giving Elizabeth a chance to explain. but I'd heard all I needed. With a final glare, I left the meeting, calls of, "Wait!" trailing behind me. The days stretched into weeks. Elizabeth tried every tactic to evade responsibility. She filed motions to dismiss, tried stalling the trial date, and even attempted to buy my silence by offering a settlement that would reimburse me for the orchard plus a bonus. The figure was staggering, but no amount of money could replace the orchard's legacy, my father's sweat and blood. I refused. Instead, I pushed for a court date that would publicly expose the entire scheme. In the midst of this legal tug-of-war, an interesting ally emerged, a local council member named Teresa Phillips. She reached out to me discreetly, saying she'd suspected corruption in the county zoning board for a while. "Elizabeth Carter has half the board in her pocket," Teresa explained over coffee. "She's thrown lavish fundraisers for them, donated to re-election campaigns, that sort of thing. But some of us on the council have grown tired of her antics. If you need any official documents or testimonies, let me know." That was a game changer. With Teresa's help, John and I uncovered a paper trail linking Elizabeth to suspicious contributions made to key board members just before the orchard's rezoning. Suddenly, our case wasn't just about property theft. It hinted at bribery and municipal corruption. The stakes were higher than ever. We prepared for a trial that would rock Oak Brook Hills to its foundation. On the day of the trial, the courthouse was packed. Media cameras lined the hallway, capturing every attorney, every board member, every snippet of tension. This time, Elizabeth Carter had an entire row of supporters, board members, residents, decked out in business attire. I arrived with John, my expression set and determined. A hush fell over the room as we took our places. The presiding judge was the same Harriet Cole who'd granted my injunction. She wasted no time, calling the case and reminding everyone that forging a deed was a serious crime, with potential civil and criminal repercussions. My opening statement laid out the orchard's history, the suspicious timeline of the deed, the non-existent environmental assessment, and the mounting evidence that Elizabeth Carter had manipulated board decisions with political payoffs. I highlighted the orchard's significance, its role in local farmers' markets, its generational heritage. Then Dan Jenkins rose, trying his best to frame me as an opportunist who had neglected the orchard for years and suddenly decided to cause trouble for the HOA. He even tried to claim the orchard was dying and that the tennis court was a better use of the land. But the turning point came when Teresa Phillips testified. She presented internal memos from the zoning board, showing how certain votes were expedited right after they received donations from Elizabeth Carter's private account. The jury's eyes flicked between Teresa and Elizabeth, whose face had turned a sickly shade of gray. Next, our forensic expert reiterated the forgery findings, then the final blow, an audio recording from a conversation between Elizabeth and a now resigned board member. The board member had recorded their phone call, and though the quality was poor, Elizabeth's voice was clear enough when she said, "I don't care if we have to fudge a few signatures, just get me that orchard. People will pay extra for homes with upscale amenities." Elizabeth's complexion drained of color. Dan Jenkins sprang to his feet, objecting on grounds of entrapment, but the judge allowed the audio in, stating it was relevant to the authenticity of the deed. I could see the jury bristling at the blatant disregard for the law. In the end, the outcome was almost anticlimactic, given how strongly the evidence pointed to Oak Brook Hill's wrongdoing. The jury ruled in my favor, finding that the orchard had been illegally obtained through fraud. They ordered the HOA to relinquish any claim to the orchard, demolish the tennis court at their own expense, and pay damages for the destruction of the trees. Additionally, Elizabeth Carter faced potential criminal charges for her role in forging documents and bribing officials. The judge's gavel came down with a finality that left Elizabeth trembling. News cameras outside the courthouse captured the moment I stepped onto the stairs, relief flooding me. I'd avenged my family's legacy, undone the injustice that had stolen those cherished trees. People from the crowd clapped or patted me on the back, including some from Oak Brook Hills who'd quietly opposed the HOA's extreme tactics. I glanced over at Elizabeth Carter, who was whisked away by Dan Jenkins, face pale and drawn. The woman who'd once exuded unwavering confidence now looked like a castle of sand battered by the surf. It took months for the demolition to occur. Ironically, the same bulldozers that had torn my orchard apart were brought back to pulverize the tennis court they'd installed. Though I watched them work, arms folded, it brought little joy. My orchard was gone, replaced by churned earth and rubble. But at least the injustice wouldn't stand. The land was mine again, free from the clutches of the HOA. I hired an agricultural consultant to see if replanting was viable. Some of the orchard's soil was salvageable, though it would require years of careful nurturing to restore. I decided not to replant the orchard in the exact same place. Instead, I set aside part of it as a memorial grove, replanting a few apple and pear trees alongside a plaque dedicated to my parents. The rest I turned into a community green space. I'd seen enough of what happened when development overshadowed heritage, so I made it open for local gatherings, kids' field trips, and small-scale farmers' workshops. People began to appreciate the land for what it was, a living testament to history rather than a trophy for an HOA's boastful expansions. As for Elizabeth Carter, she ended up stepping down from the HOA presidency. Legal battles continued to swirl around her. Some rumored she'd fled to another state. Others whispered she was negotiating a plea deal to avoid jail time. Dan Jenkins faced an ethics investigation from the state bar, his name forever tarnished for facilitating such a brazen con. Oakbrook Hills underwent a major board overhaul. The new board president publicly apologized, vowing never again to overreach or steamroll private citizens. Sometimes, I still think about that morning when I first discovered my orchard flattened. It felt like a personal attack, a war declared on everything my parents had built. But if there's one thing that day taught me, it's that the law, when wielded correctly, can serve as a shield for the powerless and a sword against the arrogant. Elizabeth Carter learned that the hard way. She might have had local officials in her pocket, but she couldn't buy off a man determined to fight for his birthright and for justice. In the end, my orchard didn't vanish entirely. New saplings now sway in the breeze, each one carrying a piece of my father's vision. The land remains open for the community, on my terms, not because some inflated HOA pinned a fee structure to it. I sometimes stand at the edge of that green space, remembering the orchard in its glory days. The legal war might be over, but the orchard's spirit endures in every blooming branch, and that, for me, is enough. Enough to let me sleep at night knowing I honored my family and made sure that no one, no matter how well connected, could simply steal what generations had nurtured. If you're reading this or listening to this and wondering if you too can stand up to the Goliaths of local politics, know that it won't be easy. You'll be tested, threatened, pushed to your limit, but bullies who hide behind fancy titles and questionable paperwork are still bullies, and they crumble when you confront them with undeniable truth. Don't let them steamroll your orchard, your home, or your community. If you hold your ground, if you gather your evidence and face them head on, you just might find that justice has a way of cutting through all the lies. And for me, well, I'll keep practicing law, defending those who can't fight back alone. Because every time I step into a courtroom, I remember how it felt to see my orchard destroyed. That memory ignites a fire within me. People say I haven't lost a real estate case since the orchard fiasco, and I have no intention of breaking that streak. Especially when so many communities still face the same threats I once did. I might have grown up in a small orchard, but today I stand tall in every legal battle, proud and unyielding. Elizabeth Carter lit the fuse when she tore down my trees, but ironically that fire burned brightest in me, fueling a fight she never saw coming. And that, my friends, is exactly how her empire of deception came crashing down.